Hey guys, welcome to Population and Community Ecology Part 2. My nose is less stuffy this morning, so I should be easier to understand. So we started off with population ecology and some of the concepts that were essential to understanding how populations increase, decrease, and how those populations change due to immigration, emigration, and that kind of stuff. So now we're going to talk about communities. Whereas in populations, we were talking about groups of individuals of the same species. Now we're talking about interactions among species in a shared community. So community ecology is the study of interactions among species. Species often interact in symbiotic relationships. You guys we've talked in the past, and you learned in biology types of symbiosis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those later. But basically here we're talking about relationships in which organisms are living in close association with one another. Sometimes species interactions can cause one or both of the species to be negatively impacted. These types of interactions include competition, predation, parasitism, and herbivory, which is probably something that you haven't discussed before in terms of negative species interaction. Competition is the struggle of individuals to obtain a shared limiting resource. So the driver here is the limiting resource and preferential access to the limiting resource. There is a principle called Gauss's competitive exclusion principle, and that states that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. One will eventually outcompete the other and drive the loser to extinction. So in Gauss's classic experiment, he grew two species of paramecium separately, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. So if you look at the top here, you see his experiment right here when they're grown separately, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudata, and the time is along the x-axis. Population densities are along the right. P. aurelia has a more of a exponential growth curve. You can see it's more J-shaped, but it eventually evens out as well, right around the carrying capacity. And by the way, food was the limiting resource in this experiment. Paramecium caudatum is less J-shaped. It's a little bit more logistic in its growth pattern, and the population densities of Paramecium caudatum again stabilized around the carrying capacity. Actual population numbers were slightly lower for that species. So when Gauss grew the two species of paramecium separately, they both achieved large stable population sizes. However, when they were grown together, Paramecium aurelia outcompeted Paramecium caudatum, and Paramecium caudatum in that culture declined to extinction. Two species competing for the same limiting resource, in this case it was food, cannot coexist. Competition for a limiting resource can lead to what we call resource partitioning. This is where two species divide a resource based on differences in either their behavior or their morphology. Morphology is body characteristics. So if you take a look at these graphs over to the right, and these graphs again came out straight out of your book. So along the x-axis we have seed size, and along the y-axis, we have number of individuals. And you can see that there's the small seed size, the medium seed size, and the large seed size. There are two species that are competing for these seeds. Competition is occurring in this overlap region in the middle, that's green. So if you look at the key right here, it says when individuals of species 2 compete with species 1 for medium seeds are the preferred seed. For these two species, both of them want those medium seeds. Individuals of species 2 experience poor survival and reproduction. Species 1 in this case is the strong competitor. And again, they're both competing for those medium seeds, which are the preferential food. As a result, natural selection will favor those individuals of species 2 that do not compete for medium seeds with species 1. So if you look down here at the next, you see the arrow, ding, 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 that goes down here, okay? And so over time, we get this resource partitioning that limits the overlap between these two species. Notice that in this next graph, species 1, which is our strong competitor, now the medium-sized seeds, which are preferential, kind of belong in their resource curve. You can see it's kind of at the end of their resource curve. And species 2 is basically, I don't want to say they've given up on competition, but natural selection has favored the individuals of that species who can survive and reproduce on the larger seeds. Now remember, in the beginning, the larger seeds were, if you look up here, were not preferential, and they were just at the very margin of what that species wanted or could tolerate. So there were some individuals that could use them, but most of the individuals could not, if you see where the peak of that curve is in comparison to those 3 seed sizes. So over time, natural selection is favoring those individuals of species 2, the weaker competitor, that can use and thrive on the larger seeds. The other thing to notice is that while the area under the curve for species 1 is unchanged, which species 1 is the better competitor, is the stronger competitor, look at the size, look at the area under the curve for species 2. The area under the curve for species 2, which is their the breadth of their niche there, the breadth of their food resources, has narrowed. So species 2 is being forced to kind of narrow their niche and narrow their food options to use less of them. Because again, if you look at the top, species 2 originally was using both the medium and the large seeds, and they've been pushed out of using the medium seeds by the stronger competitor. When competition reduces the ability of individuals to survive and reproduce, natural selection will favor individuals that overlap less with the other species in their resource use. That is resource partitioning. Predation is a species interaction where one animal kills and consumes the other. A specialized form of a predator is called a parasitoid, and you probably haven't heard about this before. You may be familiar with it, but maybe not the term. This is an animal that lays its eggs inside another organism. When the eggs hatch out, the larvae slowly consume the host from the inside out, which is kind of a gross concept. This happens actually a lot in the insect world. So to avoid predation, many prey species have evolved defenses. The defenses to avoid predation may be behavioral, such as hiding or reduced movement. We see this a lot in mammals. They may be morphological, meaning that their bodies are camouflaged to blend into their surroundings so the predator cannot find them as easily. Or they may have evolved spines on their body, tough, thick skin, or thick, horny plates that cannot be easily bit through. Their defenses may be chemical, meaning that they have toxic compounds that are secreted from their skin or glands. Toxic compounds are often used as a defense in the plant world, but you also see them in many species of amphibians and reptiles that are prone to predation. And finally, there may be mimicry involved, which means that the species actually has no actual real defenses, but they have evolved to mimic or to look like organisms that have chemical defenses. The production of toxins or chemical compounds is actually, it takes a lot of metabolic energy for an organism. So a lot of organisms have, I don't want to say they've chosen, but through the process of natural selection, they have evolved to look like dangerous or toxic creatures, but it's an advantage because their bodies are not actually producing the toxin, the metabolism, the metabolic pathways that they would need, which are expensive in terms of food and stuff like that they would need to produce those compounds they don't actually have. So it's kind of getting all the benefit without spending the metabolic resources to actually produce the toxins. Parasitism is an interaction where one organism either lives on or in another organism, and the organism that's being lived on or in is called the host. Very familiar examples: hookworms, tapeworms, fleas, ticks on animals. Parasitism usually doesn't result in the death of a host directly, but it often weakens the host to the point that it leaves the host vulnerable to other infections. Parasites also do cause infection themselves, especially things like fleas and worms. Parasites that cause disease are called pathogens. Pathogens include viruses, bacteria, fungi, protists, and helminths, which are types of worms. Herbivory is an interaction where an herbivore consumes a producer. Generally, an herbivore only consumes part of the producer and leaves the remainder to regenerate, but sometimes the herbivore actually eats the entire plant. Many producers have evolved defenses against herbivory, such as sharp spines or toxic chemicals, for this very reason. So those are some of the ways that species can interact with each other in negative ways, where one is receiving a benefit and the other is being harmed by that interaction. Sometimes, though, species interact in neutral or positive ways. So positive ways would be mutualism. Mutualism is an interaction between two species that increases the chances of survival and reproduction for both species. So both species are getting a benefit. Well-known examples of mutualism include most plant pollinator interactions, acacia trees and ants in Central America. This is one that we teach in biology. The acacia trees provide food in the form of sap and habitat for the ants, and the ants actually keep the tree safe from organisms that want to eat the acacia spines and the acacia leaves, and also other parasites that might invade the tree. Algae and coral is an example of mutualism, and we've talked a little bit about that before. Corals are animals that have symbiotic algae that live inside their tissues. And then lichens. Lichens are pioneer species. They are a blend of mutualistic algae and a fungus. Commensalism is a relationship between two species that benefits one species, but neither helps nor harms the other. So one is receiving a benefit and the other one is like, cool. Examples include scavengers that follow predators in order to eat leftovers. Again, the scavenger is getting the food benefit, but the predator doesn't care. And of course, the animal that's dead doesn't care either. Remora and sharks. Remora are fish that have a disc that allow them to attach to sharks, and they hang on for the ride with sharks. When sharks feed, the remora detach, and they eat the little bits of flesh that the shark has pulled off and left floating in the water of its prey. So the remora gets some food. They also get transportation from place to place, but they don't bother the sharks in any way. And then cattle egrets and water buffalo. Cattle egrets are the birds that kind of follow behind water buffalo or cattle that move through fields. When the cattle move through fields, they stir up insects. The cattle egrets eat the insects, so they're getting a food benefit, but the water buffalo really don't care one way or the other because they're just walking through a field. Keystone species have outsized effects on communities. We've started talking about keystone species previously, but we're going to formalize it here. Some species that are not very abundant in actual numbers can still have very large effects on a community structure. These species are called keystone species, and they play a far more important role in their communities than their relative abundance might suggest. Oftentimes, these organisms are what we consider ecosystem architects or ecosystem engineers. These are organisms that build and maintain habitat and niches for many other organisms. And we gave you some examples already. We've talked about the beaver a little bit. We've talked about the wolf. When a keystone species is an apex predator, that the removal of that keystone species or the reintroduction to an ecosystem of a keystone species can cause a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade describes the reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey through a food chain, which often results in dramatic changes in ecosystem structure and nutrient cycling. And if you remember, we gave you that visual of the wolves and the trophic cascades in Yellowstone National Park. And you guys did a critical writing on that. Trophic cascades are kind of a big deal, and you need to know what they are. So here are some examples of keystone species. We've talked about the beaver before. The beaver is an ecosystem architect, ecosystem engineer. The dams that they build change the course of rivers. They change the behavior of rivers. They provide habitat, food resources, and niches for many other species. If the beaver are removed or the beaver leave an ecosystem, many parts, both biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem change. We've already talked about the wolf and how, as an apex predator, the behavior of the wolf greatly influences many other aspects of ecosystems that it's in. Sea stars. The idea of a keystone species actually began with this guy right here. Sea stars are the apex predators in rocky intertidal pools in the Pacific Northwest. And they were doing some studies up there several years ago, and they would remove the sea stars from the tidal pools to see what would happen to the trophic structure of the tidal pool. And the answer is not only did the trophic structure collapse, but many other aspects of the tidal pool community that they did not think were directly connected to the sea stars were detrimentally affected as well. So again, sea star top predator in these rocky intertidal pools, their removal or their reintroduction caused drastic changes in the ecosystem structure of the tidal pools. Flying foxes are pollinators. In many cases, they're pollinators that they're the only pollinator of many different, especially tropical plants. And so they are considered ecosystem architects because many ecosystem interactions actually depend on the flying fox. And then mycorrhizal fungi. This is something actually that people don't think about. The fungal mats that have to do with roots underneath the ground, and that's what you're seeing there is a picture of mycorrhizal fungi underneath the ground. These fungi perform incredible ecosystem services. Fungi are decomposers, and they enrich the soil through nutrient cycling. When the fungi are removed or they are killed off due to soil contamination or groundwater pollution, nutrient cycling is very inhibited in ecosystems. So while these guys are keystone species, many of them are also ecosystem architects. Community succession. Ecological succession is the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over a period of time. We're primarily talking here about plant communities, by the way, because plant communities is what drives the animal communities in that area. Depending on the community, succession occurs over spans ranging from decades to centuries. Primary succession occurs on barren surfaces that are devoid of soil, so only abiotic factors are present. Primary succession occurs after volcanic eruptions on the newly formed land. They can also occur when glaciers recede or when a volcanic island is thrust up out of the sea. So any place that has not had soil built up previously and has been devoid of life. So pioneer species such as algae and lichens are the first to colonize the bare rock during primary succession. These early successionals, and they're not plants, algae and lichens are not plants. These early successionals secrete acids that allow them to uptake nutrients directly from the rock. They don't have roots, but they do secrete acids, and the acids actually dissolve the minerals in the rock, and then they're able to uptake those minerals from the rock. The acids that they secrete also contribute to the breakdown of the rock and create and facilitate the turning of that rock into soil. So if you remember back to when we were talking about soil building is a process that begins from the parent material up with weathering, but it also begins with the plant community down, or in this case, the early successionals down. So these algae and lichens do both chemical and physical actions on the rock, which contribute to soil building. And when they die, they decompose and they become the humus, not the humus, but the humus that add to the soil creation process. So they're incredibly important. We don't think much of them, but they're very, very important in the creation of soil and the formation of climates and communities. Communities of plants are predictably replaced with other communities until a climax community forms. So again, that's kind of the idea behind ecological succession, is that the plants, the living and the dying of these early successional species over the course of time produces deeper soil, which allows other communities and more complex communities of plants to develop until you get a climax community. And of course, the climax community of an area depends on its climate. In deserts, you're not going to get a climax community of deciduous trees. This is something that my 9th grade bio kids are always kind of screwing up. The climax community in any given biome or in any given ecosystem really depends on the climate and the abiotic factors of the area. And that's exactly what I just said. The type of climax community form depends on the biome and the climate of the area. So this is just a little visual of primary succession. We're moving from left to right here, and the scale is in hundreds of years if you look here at the bottom. So we begin with our bare rock. In this case, it looks kind of like it was the retreat of a glacier that exposed barren rock, and that's that first stage right there. And over time, we get the introduction of lichens, and lichens perform both physical and chemical changes on the rock, which begins to break it down and create soil. Of course, the bodies of the lichens as they live and die also contribute to the soil building process. As time goes on, we continue to have lichens, but we also get the introduction of small annual plants. Their seeds are usually blown in by the wind. Over time, we get a community of perennial herbs and grasses. The lichens are largely gone now at this point. As more time passes, we get grasses, shrubs, and what we call shade intolerant trees. That means trees that like full sun, because of course there's not a lot of shade at this point because the shrubs aren't providing lots of shade. So grasses, shrubs, and shade intolerant trees. Sometimes, as we teach in biology, this could also be what we call softwood trees. And then at the climax community, and of course this depends on your biome, but in this particular case, once the soil is built up enough to support larger trees, we get our shade-tolerant trees. Now, that's not to say that the grasses and the shrubs are not still there. They are, but their relative abundance is lower, and the climax community becomes dominated by these large shade-tolerant trees, which are often hardwood trees. Secondary succession occurs in areas that have been disturbed but have not lost their soil. So again, primary begins with bare rock and abiotic conditions. Secondary begins with the removal or the destruction of a plant community, but the soil is still present. So secondary succession often follows some kind of natural disaster, frequently a forest fire, sometimes a hurricane where the land has been scraped of the plant community. Secondary succession can also occur on abandoned agricultural fields. When agricultural fields are left to lie fallow, we see the area undergo secondary succession and become closer to what it once was. In fact, the beginning of your chapter 6, talks about New England farm field that was left to lie fallow when the farm was abandoned and has gone completely back to forest. The only way that you would have known that that was ever someone's farm is that the rocky walls that the farmer had put up to border his farm are still there. Pioneer species in secondary succession are often grasses and wildflowers with light windblown seeds. So again, we don't really go all the way back to the lichen stage here. And if you take a look at this picture down here, in this particular picture, forest fire was the abiotic factor that disturbed the plant community. So you get annual plants that come in the first couple of years after the forest fire. Annual plants are plants that live for 1 year. And as they live and die, they return some of the nutrients that may have been destroyed or damaged or left the ecosystem. Forest fires tend to scorch that, and when the earth gets very dry, wind can come in and pick that soil up and blow it away. So annual plants with their living and dying cycles can enrich that soil again. And again, annual plants, those tend to have windborne seeds as well. And then you get grasses and perennials coming in. And then over time, grasses, shrubs, pines, which are softwood trees, young oak and young hickory. Now, oak and hickory are hardwoods, but these would be young at this time. And then the climax community would take a while to regenerate all the way, about 150 plus years in an ecosystem like this, which we're assuming is a forest ecosystem. And it seems to be a deciduous forest based on the trees that they've chosen here. And you get your mature oak and hickory back. And that was the one, apparently the climax that was destroyed in that fire based on this particular diagram. So succession can also occur in aquatic environments. You probably saw this, guys, on your STAR test because this is one of the ones that they like to talk about. So let's first talk about rocky intertidal zones. I mentioned rocky intertidal zones when I talked about the sea stars being keystone species. Rocky intertidal zones can experience primary succession when major coastal storms overturn rocks and clear their surfaces of living organisms. So intertidal zones are very, very harsh environments, and life clings to with a lot of the organisms in intertidal zones have some way to stick themselves to rocks. They might have a sessile disc. They might have some type of mucus they secrete. They might have body morphology where they have got little suckers on the bottom like a sea star does. Because when the storms roll in, and they frequently do, if they don't have some way to attach themselves to the surfaces, then they get washed out to sea and they die. So when major storms come in, the rocks that are there in that tidal zone often get tumbled around, and in that tumbling, their surfaces get scraped clean of the organisms that were stuck to them. So then the rock is it's deposited once it's tossed around by the storm back in the intertidal zone, and organisms will come and recolonize it. That's actually considered primary succession. Even though there was life on it before, it certainly doesn't have soil. Of course, this is an aquatic environment, but it's been scraped free of the life, and so it's starting pretty much from bare rock again. Pioneer species in aquatic marine environments. So aquatic marine would be saltwater. In these marine environments would include diatoms, which are microscopic creatures with silica-based bodies, and red and green algae. But I want you to take a look here at these pictures. So intertidal zones and aquatic marine succession, we've been talking about that happens in the ocean. So let's switch over to freshwater lakes. Freshwater lakes is probably the one that you're more familiar with. They actually do undergo succession to become terrestrial habitats. So if you look at the top, time is going from the top down to the bottom. Okay, that's time. So the diagram at the top is where we begin. You have a pond there that is largely water. It's got sediment on the bottom, and it's got some rooted plants on the side. As ponds age, they fill with sediment and organic matter. The course of plants and animals living and dying, their bodies, their dead bodies build up on the bottom, create sediment, and the lake becomes shallower. So as they become smaller and shallower, they eventually become smaller and shallower ponds. And you can see that you see more emergent vegetation here. Emergent vegetation is vegetation that's rooted on the banks, but can come up above and be here at the top. So it's got the roots in the sediment, but you can also see the top of the plant. That's what they call emergent, because it's emerging from the water. And then again, over time, these smaller and shallower ponds become wetlands. So there's still a layer of water there, but it's not very deep. It's kind of wetland, freshwater wetland, estuary kind of stuff. And then finally, over time, these wetlands will fill in again with sediment to become solid ground. And that's what you're looking at the bottom. And they actually call this a hydrosphere. I'm going to write that for you. S-E-R-E, hydrosphere. It's the progression of the hydrosphere. I've only ever seen that word one time, but it just might be something good to know. So hydrosphere is this progression from a deep freshwater pond or small lake to solid ground. Species richness of a community is influenced by many factors. In a given region within a biome, the number and types of species present are determined by colonization of the area by new species, speciation of the area, and losses from the area due to extinction. This should say area right here. The area, not our area, and losses from the area due to extinction. So 3 things there. The colonization of the area by new species, the speciation of the area, and losses from the area due to extinction. So the relative importance of these processes is influenced by 4 additional factors: latitude, time, habitat size, and distance from other communities. And we're going to explore each of these in turn. So let's first talk about latitude. So as we move from the equator towards the poles, either the North Pole or the South Pole, the number of species declines. And this kind of makes sense to us, but in the same amount of space, you have a greater species richness at the equator or at a lower latitude than you do at a higher latitude. So as you move from the equator up or down to the north or to the south, the same amount of land actually holds a less biodiverse community. Time is another factor. The longer a habitat exists, the more colonization takes place, the more speciation takes place, and the more extinction can occur in the habitat. They give you an example in the book of two different lakes. One is Lake Baikal, which is in Eastern Europe. It's in Russia. And then the other one is what they call Slave Lake, which I'm not sure why they call it that, but it's in Canada. And they're the same latitude. But Lake Baikal is a very, very ancient lake. And Slave Lake is relatively much younger. So I think they said 10,000 years for Slave Lake, but Lake Baikal is almost 25 million years old. So you get a much, much, much richer and more biodiverse lake, especially in the benthic zones with lots of different kinds of invertebrates in Lake Baikal than you do in Slave Lake, even though they're at the same latitude. One is younger and one is older. The factors of habitat size and distance from another community are the basis for the theory of island biogeography. And this does actually come up on the exam fairly frequently. So larger habitats typically contain more species for three reasons. Species migrating from a mainland can more easily find larger islands. So like if you're migrating from the mainland, if the island is big, you're probably going to hit it. You're probably going to find it. If the island is small, you may not. Additionally, larger habitats can support more species than smaller habitats. Duh, this makes sense. If you're a larger habitat, you're going to have a wider range of environmental conditions and therefore more niches, and that's exactly what I just talked about. So again, larger habitats contain more species because if you're a migrating species and the island is off the shore, you're going to find it easier. Larger habitats support more species than smaller habitats because they contain a wider range of environmental conditions, which gives you more niches than smaller habitats. So distance from the mainland also affects species richness. The more distant an island is from the mainland, the more difficult it's going to be to reach by potentially colonizing species. Islands that are very, very, very far off a coast tend to have a less diverse species profile and less biodiversity just because they're so far from anywhere where a species might be able to colonize them. So between two islands of identical size with identical resources, the island that is closer to the mainland is going to have a greater species richness, which makes sense just because there's more species that are going to be able to reach it. The theory of island biogeography can also be applied to habitat islands, and this is where I've seen it applied on the exam before. So let's talk about what a habitat island is. A habitat island can be something like a national park or even a city park. These habitat islands are surrounded by inhospitable areas that are often dramatically altered by human activity. So you have these islands of undisturbed habitat in the midst of very, very disturbed habitat. So think about like a national park. A national park would be preserving an ecosystem, like let's just say the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But the area around that ecosystem has largely been changed by human activity. So the organisms are confined to this habitat island. In terms of conservation, we must consider both the size of a protected area or the habitat island and its distance from other protected areas that could provide habitat colonist species. The idea of habitat islands and this theory of island biogeography is really big with conservation. Is it better, and this is the question for conservationists, is it better to have lots of small parcels of land set aside or fewer large parcels of land set aside? And the jury's kind of out. It depends on the species and what you're trying to preserve. In any case, when you've got undisturbed areas of functioning ecosystems surrounded by inhospitable areas that have been largely disturbed by human activity, you tend to get gene reduction, you tend to get inbreeding, and some more maladaptive and negative effects in the ecosystem. So it's definitely something that conservation biologists have to think about.